At the end of July, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer made a fairly surprising announcement.
So today, as part of this process towards peace, I can confirm the UK will recognise the State of Palestine by the United Nations General Assembly in September.
Earlier in the month, French President Emmanuel Macron had made a similar announcement. Writing on X, he said, quote, "Consistent with its historic commitment to a just and lasting peace in the Middle East, I have decided that France will recognise the State of Palestine." Following France and the UK, Canada got in on the recognition game, with Prime Minister Mark Carney making the announcement.
For the reasons I cited earlier, Canada intends to recognise the State of Palestine at the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September 2025.
Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese followed soon after.
The world cannot wait for success to be guaranteed. That only means waiting for a day that will never come. There is a moment of opportunity here, and Australia will work with the international community to seize it.
For these Western nations who have long provided moral and military support for Israel, including during its ongoing war against Gaza, it was a change in diplomatic course, and a blow in the wall of support for Israel, and a blow to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who had previously attempted to warn the Western leaders not to recognise the State of Palestine.
I say to President Macron, Prime Minister Carney, and Prime Minister Starmer, when mass murderers, rapists, baby killers, and kidnappers thank you, you're on the wrong side of justice. You're on the wrong side of humanity. And you're on the wrong side of history.
As foreign leaders announced plans to recognise a Palestinian state, Israel was planning an assault to raze Gaza City to the ground. It has now launched a massive new offensive against the city and ordered around 1 million people into the south, and yet more danger and uncertainty. This week, what's Israel doing in Gaza, and why are some Israeli citizens protesting the move? What does recognition of a State of Palestine mean for Israel, and is Israeli foreign diplomacy failing? My name is Hugo Goodridge, and you're listening to The New Arab Voice. The recent announcement by Western states that they intend to recognise the State of Palestine at the upcoming UN General Assembly in September did come as a surprise to many. A number of EU nations have already announced their recognition of a State of Palestine, including Ireland, Spain and Sweden. They would probably be best described as more traditional supporters of Palestine. But France and the UK, while always declaring their support for a two-state solution, have always stood on the side of Israel. When the war against Gaza erupted, they announced their complete commitment to Israel's cause. They provided arms to help Israel in its cause. They ignored or obfuscated around claims of war crimes and genocide. Announcing their decision to recognise a Palestinian state, they spoke of ongoing humanitarian crises in Gaza, the actions being committed against civilians by the Israeli army, and the growing number of often fatal attacks by Israeli settlers in the West Bank. All perfectly valid reasons to change course. They likely made the decision for a couple of other reasons. Firstly, within their countries there's been a growing outrage at the crimes being committed in Gaza, and there is a desire by these governments not to be on the wrong side of a growing public opinion. And secondly, it was notable that with one announcement came many. Although we can't say for sure, it's certainly plausible that they followed a safety in numbers approach, probably with the hope that the ire of nations that still offer unwavering support to Israel, namely the US, is spread between them. For the citizens of those nations, outrage at what is happening in Gaza is a reasonable response. To date, at least 63,000 people have been killed, with a recently leaked Israeli military report saying that over 80% of those killed were civilians. And the death toll from the Israeli-created famine is also climbing every day. As of August 28th, 317 had starved to death, including 121 children. And the situation is not likely to improve with the recently announced plans to target Gaza City.
Well, several weeks ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu somewhat surprisingly announced a new offensive on Gaza.
This is Paul Scham. For 17 years, Paul was the professor of Israeli studies at the University of Maryland. Paul developed ataxia, a neurological condition which affected his speech and prevented him from lecturing.
The offensive they announced was said to reconquer or reoccupy all Gaza in pursuit of the government's stated intention to destroy Hamas and apparently reoccupy it for some indefinite period. This produced clear opposition from the chief of staff of the IDF.
While Netanyahu's plans to occupy the entirety of the Gaza Strip were supported by the far-right elements of his government, Israeli military leaders were far from happy with the plan. According to Israeli media reports, the army's chief of staff, Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir, warned Netanyahu that attempting to occupy the Gaza Strip would be, quote, tantamount to walking into a trap and also risking the lives of the hostages that remained.
The opposition to a war by the chief brass of the army is unusual, probably unique.
Paul believes there are three reasons for this military dissent.
One is the exhaustion of the army, the likelihood of heavy casualties, and the low morale of the troops. The second reason is the probability that some or all of the remaining living hostages will be hurt or more likely killed. And that is what's most important to Israeli opinion. The third expressed reason is the effect on the inhabitants of Gaza that 1 million people will have to be displaced into somewhere which everywhere is already crowded. So the humanitarian aspect is being expressed by the army, even as 20 or 30 Gazans are being killed daily in airstrikes. So the feeling is, even by the army, that the Gazans are being mistreated, or certainly will be if this offensive takes place.
So much was the opposition from the military chiefs that the offensive has been scaled back to target Gaza City alone. This, of course, will be little solace to the people of Gaza. Around 1 million people are living in the city, many of whom have already been displaced multiple times. They are now being ordered to move south, with little to no guarantees of aid or shelter. While the military chiefs were talking to Netanyahu behind closed doors, and also steadily leaking material to the press, on the streets, Israeli citizens were being explicitly clear in their opinions.
Israeli society is as polarized as any society in the world that isn't an actual civil war.
We could spend all day dissecting the varying groups and factions in Israeli politics, but to try and keep things simple, we can pick out a few broad protest groups. The first would be the secular Ashkenazi Jewish Israelis. often of European descent, and typically with higher levels of education, and on the more well-off end of society.
And they are the ones who have always been at the head of any anti-war movement.
Also on the street are those who are explicitly politically opposed to the current government. They might also want the war to end, but perhaps predominantly, they seek to end the Netanyahu government.
There is also an explicitly left-wing anti-war contingent that meets whenever there's a demonstration at a certain place, and that's understood to be explicitly trying to bring down the government.
While there is a sizable contingent on the street who want the war to end, it is not the predominant cause that is leading the protests.
That said, most of the energy in the protest comes from the demand on the part of the Israelis to get the hostages back. That is the rallying cry, and that's what brings out the crowds. And there have been demonstrations for that since October 7th. In recent weeks, when we've seen a huge expansion of the protests, they are joining the hostage families, but it's clear that they are angry about the offensive, the continuation of the war.
The protests are a mix of people. Some leftists, some more centrist, others might be more right-wing, but not supportive of Netanyahu's right-wing government. They all want the return of the hostages, but some groups want that plus added extras. But despite the varying opinions of what is wanted, it would be fair to say that the leaders of the protest movement and the people with the loudest voices are the hostage families, those whose loved ones were taken and have either been previously released, killed, or remain captive in Gaza. They have their own organization, the Hostages and Missing Families Forum.
I would say the most prominent organizers are hostage families, and the opposition parties are along for the ride in some ways. At this point, Israel has a weak and divided opposition. They are united in almost all wanting the war to stop, but they are not very ideological. They're centrist. They are not saying, giving a different vision of Israel. They are not saying that we have been totally in a wrong course. They do criticize the far right parties and the messianic aspect of them, but there is no really recognized or effective leader of the opposition.
The hostage families have proven to be an effective force. They have been a constant voice for the hostages since the start of the war, have never stopped petitioning the government, and have not been afraid to speak up against the government when they felt it necessary. They have protest power, but no political power.
They feel the government is out of control, but they have very little political power because the government has 67 Knesset members out of 120, a comfortable majority, and they are solidly in Netanyahu's camp. So there seems a lot of energy being expended, but not a lot of hope that things will change soon.
Opposition politicians have attended the protests, spoken with hostage families, and spoken out against the government. Yair Golan, leader of the Democrats Party, has been one of the most vocal, although nationally his support is not great, with polls suggesting that his party would only pick up around 10% of the seats if elections were held today. Currently in Israel, very few individual parties, if any, have the political power to challenge Netanyahu. But on the streets, Israeli citizens are stepping in and challenging the government, both on their actions and their record. And as citizens of Israel take to the streets, in the international arena, Western governments are also taking action. Most notably, as we mentioned, by announcing their intention to recognise the State of Palestine. To the citizens of those nations, it may have come as a surprise. But what about in Israel? Was the Israeli leadership surprised to see their allies go against their wishes?
I'm not sure that it was totally surprised.
This is Dr. Nimrod Goren, president and founder of Mitvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies.
Not only in terms of whether it had information that this is coming or not, but just the trajectory of international diplomacy vis-à-vis Israel, especially of the countries involved. The intention of recognizing a Palestinian state, I think, was voiced by some of these countries already some time ago, earlier in the war. And then as criticism on Israel has been stepped up, as the Gaza war has been continuing, as tensions flare, I think it became a bit clear that this is drawing near.
The relationship between Israel and its Western allies has been on a downward trajectory. And as more information about the humanitarian conditions inside Gaza has spread, and the longer Israel has refused to provide adequate levels of aid, the greater public opinion has turned against Israel, and the faster the relationship has gone downhill. For supporters of Palestine, who sought this recognition long before the start of the war against Gaza, it's a welcome development, although it still remains to be seen what it actually means.
Some say it's mostly a symbolic step that actually courts domestic needs of those leaders who want to show that they are doing something. Palestinians may be skeptical on how much this is actually changing things on the ground. Pro-peace Israeli supporters of the two-state solutions do not see that as a threat like our government does. And for the coalition of Netanyahu, the far-right coalition, it's also a way of projecting some aggressive notion towards countries that are critical of Israel, which also can carry some domestic electoral gains for them. So this is kind of the construct, and eventually everybody is doing their part in this, but I think nobody is really surprised that we are actually getting there.
The recognition provides something for everyone. For Western leaders, they can be sympathetic to a cause that is supported by a growing number of their population and gain some political capital. And for the Israeli government, they can use the recognition to lash out at other nations and present themselves as defiant, gaining some support from political allies. Helpfully, at least in the short to medium term, neither side is going to have to make any really large, financially costly actions. So, for the time being, it's unclear what recognizing a Palestinian state means in a practical sense. And given recent events, it appears that Israel is determined to follow the path that it has laid down for itself. So, could these nations seek to take further action against Israel?
So one school of thought in Israel that if it didn't happen until now, what will change it? Okay, what will be the game changer? So there are some people in Israel saying this is the status quo. Yes, there will be more bumps on the road, but it could be managed. There's another school of thought saying that things are constantly deteriorating, and at one point of time there will be a game-changing event that will lead to a total collapse of many of these relationships.
We're reaching the 2-year mark since the start of the war against Gaza, and the announcement to recognise the State of Palestine is some of the strongest action that we have seen against Israel by the likes of France and the UK. If you're the Israeli government, it's not unreasonable to think that this might be the worst to come.
So with all the criticism, I think in Israel there is an indication that the EU is important, that the current attitude by the EU Commission that took office a few months ago is willing to engage with Israel, is looking for some transactional positive agenda kind of approach. And some countries in Europe are taking a turn more to the right and therefore lessening their criticism of Israel. So that's kind of one thinking in Israel of why things with Europe are not as bad as they could be. But then if you sketch a bit further and you go on the softer side of things that are not necessarily on the state level, the public opinion, the culture, the academia, the sport, there I think you see a lot of resentment and reluctance towards Israel, a very big damage to the brand of Israel, to the willingness to engage, to cooperate, to include Israelis in such things, and that may deteriorate even if state-to-state relations keep the same. And for many Israelis, that's very worrying, that's a concern, that impacts also our daily lives and the opportunities that Israel could have on the global stage.
In terms of further action by blocs like the EU, it likely wouldn't be Israel's political class that would be targeted. Political actions are difficult and fraught with complications. It would most likely be cultural, sporting, academic and scientific fields that would feel the repercussions. At the end of July, the European Commission voted on whether to exclude Israel from the Horizons European Investment Council Research Fund, potentially denying them tens of millions of euros of research funds. Ultimately, they were not excluded. Both Germany and Italy sought more time to examine the proposition, while Hungary, Bulgaria, and Czechia opposed taking any further action. Despite this move proving unsuccessful, it is evidence of further action. Not strictly political action, but academic action. If all is well, then Israel probably shouldn't have to be dealing with stuff like this. It shouldn't have to be defending itself from its supposed allies. It's the job of the foreign ministry to manage relations and work with allies, to allay fears and prevent breakdowns.
The Israeli foreign ministry has been weakened for almost a decade. I think it was Netanyahu 2015 when the weakening of the foreign ministry was really being stepped up and seen. I think it didn't almost stop. So responsibilities were taken out of the foreign ministry to other ministries, budget cuts were happening, some delegitimization of some of the diplomats, of being maybe too soft on some issues, the marginalization of the professional action on the foreign service for actual decision making. Those are things that led the foreign ministry to be more weak than it should.
Israel's foreign ministry has been managed better in the past, most recently with the inter-Netanyahu period between 2021 and 22, when Naftali Bennett served as prime minister. During this period, Israel enjoyed productive relations with nations like Jordan and Turkey.
All of those were actually led by career diplomats that under that government were given the space to act, and under the current government are sidelined, and they are sidelined, by the way, because it's difficult for some of them, I think, to represent extremist policies that are beyond what maybe the professional level can easily convey to international partners.
The politics of the current government, with its far-right bent, is difficult for many to stomach. And given the opportunity, there are some who are simply leaving the foreign ministry altogether.
Partly it's technical issues, the weakness of the foreign ministry that I mentioned before, the competitive salaries that they can get in the private sector. These are things that are not only happening in Israel, they are happening elsewhere as well. Then there is the politicization of diplomacy. And again, that's something that you see in multiple countries, that diplomacy that used to be a very professional kind of field of work is becoming more and more politicized in a way that politicians are involved in daily diplomatic affairs rather than only stepping in when there is a major event or a crisis.
High-paying private sector jobs are certainly alluring, but also a career in the foreign ministry isn't as attractive as it once was.
And then there is the ideological component when things going in such an extreme direction as they are here in Israel, and there are people who have devoted their career, decades of their professional life, to trying to improve international relations, and are seeing things happen that they cannot really subscribe to. So eventually it's individuals, and each one is making their own decisions. Some will be very open, very blunt about why they are doing that. Others will have, will do it more quietly. But there is a trend of some senior Israeli diplomats that have been leaving the foreign ministry before getting to the end of their supposed career term within the ministry. And eventually it means that the high-level echelon of the foreign ministry is not as strong as it could be, and that Israel is losing some of its diplomatic big shots, in a way, at a time when it should have needed them the most. And that's a reality. And I think it's not ending. And if the current trajectory continues and the current type of government that we have will continue, probably we will see more in that, and you will see less and less of the good people willing to enter it.
In recent months, the Foreign Ministry has seen Neil Gillon, former ambassador to India, the Netherlands and Italy, and also the former Deputy Director General for Europe, Eric Lillian, former ambassador to Turkey, Yehuda Yaakov, an expert on the US and former Consul General in Boston, as just some of the names who have chosen to leave the diplomatic service. For people in the West, none of these are household names. Most probably aren't household names in Israel. But they do represent a genuine loss. Collectively, these people had years of experience and knowledge. And if reports from former senior diplomats are to be believed, then the people who have been chosen to replace them lack the necessary skills and experience. And with the roles becoming increasingly politicized, the space for diplomacy shrinks. Diplomacy is supposed to be a long game, securing the future of a nation, not just the term of the government. In Israel, diplomatic roles have become combative roles, fighting on behalf of the government of the day and their ideology.
The Israeli mindset, again, is one in which the world is generally critical of Israel, right? And if you look, for example, at Israeli attitudes towards the United Nations, we have the UN General Assembly coming up next month in September. So whenever there's a multilateral and international setting, the initial Israeli reaction is one of suspicion, skepticism of seeing those groupings as somehow critical or sometimes even hostile to Israel. So it's not, people do not perceive as given international support. And for Israelis to be benefiting from regional international support is a rather new phenomena that I think Israel is very much like. Okay, it opens doors for things that Israel did not experience or did not have opportunities to do in the past.
This mindset has also eroded the goodwill that Israel once had with Western nations.
There is a frustration in Israel because the sense is that after such a terrible day that Israel experienced on October 7th and the initial support that Israel got from the international community, the fact that from that situation we are now in a position where we're talking about boycotts and isolationism, that's a big failure again of the leadership. So there is maybe disappointment from some in the international community that do not understand what Israel is going through or do not understand Israeli positions or motivations, but there is also a frustration from the Israeli government that did not do enough to preserve it and that basically did or took actions that deteriorated the situation.
The ongoing war against Gaza, the increased levels of starvation, the slaughter of civilians, and now the operation against Gaza City have all contributed to the recent diplomatic actions against Israel we've seen Western governments taking. Currently, Israel does not look like it's slowing down its assault. And even if it does get all the hostages back, there's no guarantee that the war would end. And if public opinion against Israel continues to grow in Western nations, maybe they could be forced to take further actions. Israel might be looking down the barrel of a prolonged period of international isolation. Is it ready for that?
So there is a vast majority within the Israeli public that is not supportive of the policies of the current government and is very concerned that the policies are currently being played out because of concerns for political survival of Netanyahu and are not putting at the forefront what the national need or the national interest is. And part of the national interest, as I mentioned before, is to have good, functioning, effective international relations. And when the isolation that you mentioned, if this is stepped up, then I think this is becoming a danger for Israelis that limits the ability of our country to live in prosperity. So that creates, I think, a rift within our society. And it also is an issue for countries that seek to pressure Israel to think what steps they actually take. Because we see countries that are focusing their steps on Israel on representatives of the far right of the current coalition. We saw Australia limiting the visa of quite an extreme politician, or countries that do not allow ministers Ben-Gvir and Smotrich to enter. So those are steps that are specifically geared to those parts of the society that are seen as extreme and illegitimate. It's very different than steps that impact Israelis as a whole and are basically weakening those sectors in Israel that are more liberal, more internationalist, that you need to empower them so they are capable of bringing the change that so many in Israel and beyond want to see happening. So it's becoming, I think, a very nuanced conversation for those countries that are wishing to take steps that will pressure Israel or indicate a lack of satisfaction, let's say, from what Israel is doing.
Paul Scham again.
Traditionally, Israelis, or many of them, have assumed that criticism of Israel is either misguided or anti-Semitic. Obviously, anti-Semitism has been weaponized very strongly, especially in Israel and the U.S. At the same time, there is starting, I feel, in the last couple of months with the claims of the proofs of starvation, Israeli media is showing more of this, and there is a beginning of a public recognition that Israel is becoming a pariah, and it can't be chalked up to anti-Semitism.
What Israel is doing in Gaza and the West Bank needs to end. That goes without saying. And if the international community wants to support Palestine by officially recognising the State of Palestine, that would be a great help. The international community must open up directly to Palestine. Should have opened up directly to Palestine a long time ago, but better late than never. The international community does need to be open to Israel as well. Like it or not, any problems between Palestine and Israel can't be solved without both nations. The international community doesn't need to isolate the country, only those who are unwilling to talk. In little over a year, Israel will hold parliamentary elections. It will likely be one of the closest elections the country has ever seen. And the international community will have to be ready to talk with those who want to be part of the solution. And as the protests have shown, there are those in Israel who do want to be part of that solution. This episode of The New Arab Voice was written and produced by me, Hugo Goodridge. Our theme music was by Omar Al-Fil. The New Arab Voice will be back with a new episode shortly. Don't forget to subscribe to get notified when a new episode drops. Find a link in the show notes. Until then, you can find all our previous episodes on all major podcast platforms. You can also check out our social media accounts on Instagram and X, both at TNA Podcasts, for additional content. And you can email us, podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com. You can subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and you can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Don't forget to follow The New Arab on Facebook, X and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region.